Man, you cannot marry a woman without gills. You're from two different worlds. Oh, I've wasted my life.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and I like to bring Eric Breen on the channel every once in a while to talk a little bit of like introspective about the comic book industry, maybe talk about something in the past. He's such a wealth of knowledge, been a comic book reader for 45 years now, and welcome back to the channel, Eric Breen. How you doing?
I'm doing good, Wes. Thanks for having me back.
Well, I'm glad you fit me into your very busy schedule. It's always so hard getting you here on the channel, but I will definitely adjust my schedule to meet your needs because I love getting you on the channel and talking to you. You just have such a great outlook on the comic book industry, in the hobby in general. And today we're going to talk something that's a little different off the beaten path of what we've done in the past, but we're going to talk a little bit about comic book events and maybe how they've evolved over years. It seems like, back in the day, comic events were pretty rare. They didn't happen very often. You certainly wouldn't maybe even get one a year. But when a comic book event happened, it was a happening. It was a huge deal. And it usually meant that something was going to alter as far as the entire Marvel universe, maybe the DC universe. There was an enormous status quo change. Is that how you remember comic events back in the day?
Yeah, well, as you pointed out, I've been reading comics for 45 years, so I have pretty much seen almost all of the events. Now, there were a few that predated me, and, I did a little research, and what's commonly referred to as the first event at Marvel, oddly enough, was Reed and Sue's wedding in Fantastic Four Annual number 3, because it was the first time that the Marvel cast of characters assembled in one book. And it was for a wedding, but they came in costume, of course, because it was a comic book. So, and over the next 10 or so years at Marvel, a couple of other things were considered events, like the Kree Skrull War. The one that sticks out for me as being like the first true event in comics, because over at DC you had, the annual JSA, JLA get-togethers, but the JSA didn't have a book, and they were in the Justice League every, like once a year. But at Marvel in 1973, they did the Avengers Defenders War, and it crossed over in between both books. And, the Avengers were a well-established team, obviously, as everybody knows, and the Defenders were a new team, but the Defenders had Doctor Strange, Silver Surfer, Namor, the Hulk, and they were one bad-ass team. And they fought over, they were fighting to gain control of this thing called the Evil Eye, which, the villain of the piece, which was Dormammu, wanted to use to, rule the world. And for fans, getting to root for their favorite heroes, and each individual members of both teams fought each other, and it culminated with with a Thor Hulk battle. It was like the last battle that led into the rest of the story. And for fans, 47 years ago, I can only imagine how neat that was, because no one had ever done that before, really, from either company. And following that, I would say the next big event would be the first Superman Spider-Man team up, because it was the first time that the two companies had come together to put out a book featuring each company's main character. I mean, a year before they collaborated on a Wizard of Oz tabloid, but this was big. Really, from that point, there was a couple of X-Men events, what were considered events, like the Phoenix Saga, then the Dark Phoenix Saga, then Days of Future Past. But it really wasn't until the mid 80s that the two companies started doing what is now more commonly referred to as events, with Secret Wars at Marvel, and then Crisis on Infinite Earths at DC.
Yeah, and DC always seems to use those crisis events as a reset, or maybe a reboot of the continuity. Maybe when their continuity gets a little too out of hand and they need to rein it in, they tend to have a crisis event, kind of to bring all their ducks back in a row and move the universe forward, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Now, the one in 1985 was absolutely necessary, because DC ran a lot different than Marvel. I mean, like, Superman, Batman, Flash, Green Lantern, they all had their own editorial groups, and they were all out doing their own thing, for decades. And there were so many Earths and so many continuities, and When they would do their imaginary stories, half of their fans probably didn't even know they were imaginary stories because it was like an anything goes at that company. And when Jeanette Kahn came in the mid 70s, she decided we really need to clean this universe up, or in this case, universes. So several years into her tenure, they came up with the idea to do Crisis, and you got Marv Wolfman and George Perez to spearhead it. And it did what it was supposed to do. It basically took the multiverse and put it back into one Earth, so it's a much more manageable timeline and continuity, and basically gave the universe a much needed reset. Whereas over at Marvel, Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars was kind of originally designed to sell toys.
Yeah, I've read a story on it actually. When they talk about how they came up with the name, Marvel did a lot of kind of focus groups, and they would ask comic readers what words stood out to them, and the two biggest words that they thought were interesting were secret and wars. They said, let's just call it Secret Wars. That should garner a lot of interest, and a lot of things came out of Secret Wars, especially the new Spider-Man suit. Correct?
Yes, that was the one true lasting effect of Secret Wars, because and that was also the catalyst for the Thing to leave the Fantastic Four, because John Byrne was given a Thing solo series, and even though he was doing Fantastic Four at the time, he didn't want the two to be like a crossover book. He wanted them to be separate, so he had She-Hulk join the Fantastic Four after the Secret Wars, and the Thing stayed on the Secret Wars world to begin his solo series. So yeah, there were repercussions. I mean, obviously nothing like Crisis, but they did have some. And then he the next year he did a Secret Wars 2, because Jim Shooter, I think, had a special affinity for the Beyonder character that was shared by maybe no one else, but he did want to do a follow up to it, and that had some interesting aspects to it. I mean, the Beyonder trying to learn humanity, being just the most powerful character ever created in comics.
But when we talk about some of these earlier events, in the 80s, like your Crisis on Infinite Earths, your Secret Wars, they were so unique, and they just didn't come around very often. As a reader, they felt absolutely special, though.
Oh yeah. As again, like I said, you could say it opened the floodgates. And DC, for the next several years after Crisis, they came back in 86 with Legends, and 87 with Millennium, and a year later with Invasion. And those still felt special because those events crossed over into other books, and you didn't have to read the other books, but you wanted to, because you were missing essential parts of the story if you didn't. And it didn't. And events in those days didn't feel like the cash grabs that they would later become. They felt like something that, as a comic book fan, it's like, man, they are finally giving me, the reader, what I want. Something that happens in book A matters in book B and book C. And as it was a great time to be a comic book reader in the late 80s. And Marvel capitalized on the success they had by, they were doing annual events that were kind of eccentric, with Fall of the Mutants, Mutant Massacre, Inferno, and then they did Acts of Vengeance to close the decade. But they would cross over into other books. But the first three were basically X-Men focused, but they were great stories, and it was like must reading. So fans had it great in the second half of the 80s.
So in my experience with reading, and I have not read all the events, I have not been reading for 45 years, but I really think DC, as a publishing company with a publishing history, I think they do events better. And they've had more recently, they've had more really good events. I think of Flashpoint, Blackest Night, which is probably my favorite event. Dark Knight's Metal hit really big. And there's the duds in there. I believe, is it Identity Crisis, I think, wasn't quite as well received. Convergence, not quite as well received. But I think for the most part, DC has maybe not used that event strategy quite as much, and they've really hit it, especially if Jeff Johns is leading an event. Let's be honest.
Well, I would say that I'll agree with you. Blackest Night was an incredible event, at that time, both companies were really experiencing a creative explosion, in my opinion, because Marvel had House of M into Civil War, into Annihilation, into Planet Hulk, into Secret Invasion, into Dark Reign, into Siege. DC had the Infinite Crisis, and there are literally hundreds of books that you can read that tie into that series. And they followed that up with, unfortunately, Grant Morrison's Final Crisis, which I don't count, but it did lead to a great Batman story where, Batman was presumed dead, and then all the events that led up to his coming back, and then the battle for the cowl. But then, Blackest Night was, like I said, an incredible event. And so both companies were really doing well from, say, like 2005 to 2010. I don't know how much, I would say how good of an event Flashpoint was, because it led to something that I was never truly a fan of, being the New 52, because I'm not sure DC was as broke as they thought that needed to be fixed.
New 52 has a weird history. I think a lot of people think of it in a negative light, but if you look at the sales and the response, initially it was a huge success. They made all the heroes assholes. And that was a mistake.
And that was evident from the first issue of Justice League, because the Green Lantern was the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern. And I think New 52 initially kind of did the same thing that the Ultimates did at Marvel at the very beginning. They went for shock and awe. They wanted to show that these characters are so different now, except for Batman and Green Lantern, that editorial said, we're going to pretty much leave those two franchises intact, as much as we can, because those were the two franchises that were selling well when they did Flashpoint into New 52. But the rest of them was like they went out of their way, because the Superman was unrecognizable from even 2 months before. Both versions, practically, the George Perez and Superman and Grant Morrison's in Action Comics. But now looking back through a historical lens, there's a lot of good to be found in the New 52. But at the time, I said that Flashpoint event itself, I said I always kind of have a little bit against that, simply because New 52 didn't do it for me as it first aired, so to speak.
So it gets kind of interesting when we talk about modern day events, and specifically with Marvel. And I think people know that I'm not fond of Brian Michael Bendis, but he definitely had a hand up in this. It's the way that he kind of, when he was the big name at Marvel, one event always led into the next event, which always led into another event. It never truly established a new status quo or reset or did something definitive to where you push the universe forward. It almost feels like the events themselves are now just to serve as a jumping on point to another event, or as I like to call it, a self-licking ice cream cone.
No, that's a very good point. It's I will say that going back to the second half of the first decade of the 2000s, those events all seem to interlock, and in those days, like I said, you had Civil War, Annihilation, and Planet Hulk, and going on at the same time. The characters did not cross over, and now if you did an event, is it, well, in the Hulk's own book, he's off in space. It doesn't matter. Just use them anyway, because they don't care about that stuff anymore. At least in 15 years ago, they took enough care to make sure that the pieces fit, and that if one event was leading into another, there was a reason for it, and not because the company had lost interest in the event they were doing, which just seems like what happens with Marvel almost routinely now.
When you're reading multiple events and you're seeing, we'll take DC, because I do follow them a little bit more than Marvel nowadays. When you've got Batman, in doing City of Bane in his regular series, and then in the Justice League, he is in another galaxy fighting Apex Lex and Perpetua, and then in there was another event all going on, but he's clearly in three places. Oh yes, Event Leviathan. He's in Seattle trying to stop Leviathan from taking over the world in one night. As a reader, does it feel like, why should I care about this? Because it's obviously you didn't care enough to keep all your ducks in a row. You have a man literally in three places at once.
Well, that's been a problem, for all 45 years I've been reading, but it just seems like now that then they would at least attempt to explain how all the pieces fit. Now, I'm not sure either company cares. And I made a comment, the other day. I said, "Wow, DC finally is practicing continuity," and unfortunately, it was Bendis' Superman reveal. But one of the things that you just mentioned, one of the problems that this industry has become so event centric that the individual books themselves, they start to it feels like they're putting events in every title, because every like 6 issues, 'cause when you're writing for the trade, everything has to feel so grandiose, and there's no time to let the characters breathe, and there's no room for non-powered supporting casts. Those have disappeared almost completely off the comics landscape in the almost half century that I've been reading. And I think that's something that comic books really miss. But then again, it's at this point, would new readers even know that there was ever a time when you could read a certain character's book and see what was going on in their home life or in the neighborhoods where they lived and whatnot? And not only are there event after event from both companies, it seems like I said, the books themselves feel like they're miniature events, and it's like when everything's an event, then nothing is. And that's kind of how I feel where we are with comics now.
One of my biggest complaints, I don't know if you feel exactly the same way, but we're about to find out. It feels like there's almost no originality if you look at the events that we're about to get from DC Comics. Death Metal, direct sequel to Dark Knight's Metal, which was pretty original. The in-between portion between that to get to 5G has been described as something similar to Convergence. DC 5G feels like maybe it's DCU, or maybe it could even be Marvel Now or Marvel's Ultimate Universe, where you're having different versions of the characters and kind of an alternate universe. Where every crisis now, with DC, there's always a new Infinite Crisis, even though the final crisis finally happened. Over at Marvel Comics, how many times can we tell the Infinity Gauntlet story? The big Spider-Man story last night was Kraven's Last Hunt, just retold in a new way. It feels like they just recycle everything over and over nowadays. We just don't get much original anymore.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, Marvel is certainly good for the environment, because boy, do they recycle.
Absolutely.
And it's unfortunate too, because like I said, Kraven's Last Hunt is an all-time classic story. That character should never have been used again. Why let one great story stay great when you can milk that cow one more time? And it's unfortunate, but that's kind of where we are, in the industry now.
Yeah, I really like Kraven's Last Hunt so much, because it's not really even, Spider-Man's on the book, but it's not a Spider-Man story, really. It's a Kraven story.
It is.
Spider-Man's a supporting character in it.
It was a tremendous...
I think that makes it interesting.
Yeah, it was a tremendous send-off to a character that character had grown and developed through the years, and he had almost like a raw sense of nobility to him in the hands of the right writers, and it just all came together. And that story, I mean, that's like I said, it's an all-time classic story, and that's also considered an event. And that was in the late 80s. So again, that was part of that. That was a heck of a time to be, a comic book fan.
So I think we're about out of time here. Like I said, I always love having you on the channel. I personally would suggest if you're a new reader, if you're a viewer on the channel, and you're like, oh, well, maybe these new events aren't hitting for you. They're not hitting for me either. Go back in time. We got to go back. Go read some of that good stuff from the 80s and the 90s, when events felt special, and it really felt like DC, heart and souls, and really went out of their way to get the best possible product to the customers.
I agree. I said back in the day when it was supposed to just tell good stories for comic book fans, and now it seems like they're trying to please the live action audience as well, and trying to please stockholders in the bottom line. They just don't have the organic feel that they did 20, 30 years ago. And so I do agree with you on that. There's plenty of great stories to be mined if you just know where to look. And there's a website called Comic Book Reading Order. You can just go to that, type in events, and about 100 will pop up, and you can just pick and choose from that.
Awesome. Well, I will have a link to that website in the video description if the viewers would like to go see that. I'm going to check it out myself. This is new news for me. And I do want to say thank you very much, Eric, for joining me. Love talking comics with you, man.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.